Hello, I'm Gofer from the Golda Meir Institute, and I'm here with Francine Klagsbrun, the author of this book, Lioness, Golda Meir, and the Nation of Israel. As you can see, it's a heavy book, but it's not heavy just in his weight. It's a very rich book about the life and action of Israeli fourth Prime Minister Golda Meir. I'll just say a little bit to introduce Francine. Francine Klagsbrun is an award-winning American author of more than a dozen books, several on Jewish tradition and practice. Her most recent book, Lioness, Golda Meir and the Nation of Israel, which we talk about today, won the National Jewish Book Council's 2017 Books of the Year Award. Planned television series by Disney Studios, based on the book, will follow Meir's life from childhood onward and will star Israeli actress Shira Haas as Golda. Barbara Streisand is executive producer of the series, which is very exciting, I think. And Francine Francine is not just the author; it's much more than that. She was the forefront of having women ordained as rabbis in the conservative movement, and was the first woman to carry Torah in the Western Wall in Jerusalem. And I read it just yesterday, and it was earlier than I thought. When was that?
I don't remember, 1988 or something like that, was it?
I read about it, and it was okay. And among other things, she's currently working on a biography of Henrietta Saul, and for the very prestigious Jewish Lives series, published by the Yale University Press. So, and thank you for joining us and talking to us about this book, which is very interesting. And I told Francine before, and I will say it again. I'm envious of you because you read this exciting materials about Meir, about Golda, her letters, her minutes, and other things. And this book is so rich and so elaborate and interesting. So thank you very much for the book. And I will start with the, I think, obvious question from the beginning. Why did you decide to write this biography?
I have to be honest, it wasn't totally my decision. The editor of the book at Shakin Books asked me to write it. She felt that there had not been a really comprehensive book about Golda, and since I am both active in the Jewish community and written a great deal, and I used to have a column until just recently. I had a monthly column in the Jewish Week, which was a very popular Jewish paper. So she asked me to write it, and I thought that would be a wonderful challenge. I never realized how challenging it would be, but I thought, yes, I would like to do that, and I'd like to know more about Golda.
And why did you think you would like to do that? What connected to Golda? What attracted you to say yes? I understood it's not your initiative, but what attracted you to her?
I didn't know Golda herself, but I lived through the period when she was prime minister and earlier, and I've been to Israel dozens of times. I'm a great Zionist, I'm an American Zionist, and I love Israel, and I admired Golda in my younger days when I knew about her, but I didn't know that much about her. And I thought, well, this is a chance to really learn something about her and to do a comprehensive biography, which I had not really done. The first book I ever wrote was a biography of Sigmund Freud, but it was for young people. So it was not that comprehensive. So I thought this would be a really exciting challenge, and it was.
And do you think it's especially important to read about her now?
Yes, I do. I absolutely do. I think people don't know about her, and I think given the situation in Israel and the complexities and the issues about settlement and so on, it's very important to know where Golda stood about this and what she thought about it, which was quite different than, I don't know about the current group, but certainly than Netanyahu had thought. And, Golda never wanted, if we get a little bit off the subject here, but Golda did not want to settle or have settlements in very populated Arab areas. She really felt that it was not good for Israel. She was not concerned so much about the Arabs, but that was not good for Israel. She wanted settlements, and she saw them as important for defense, not for expansion of the country necessarily. So it was a very different philosophy. And I think it's important for people to know where Golda stood, because she was to my mind, a brilliant woman, an influential woman, and somebody that people should know her thinking, because not enough people know it today.
So we jumped a little bit to the end, but we'll go back to the beginning, and maybe we'll talk about it later again. But I'm going back to the beginning of the book, in the introduction that call me Golda, which is wonderful, I think. You wrote that there's a huge difference between the image of Golda in Israel and in United States, and especially in Jewish society in the United States, or Jewish public opinion in the United States. What is the difference, and why do you think it's this huge gap between these two Goldas, the Israeli Golda and the American Golda?
Well, first, the American Golda, Americans love Golda. American Jews and non-Jews love Golda. Americans saw Golda, American Jews saw Golda as one of us, but she did what we didn't have the courage to do. She left the country and went to create a new land, and that made most of us feel a little guilty, or very guilty. But we admired her, and she was sort of the local girl who made good, and she would come here regularly, meet with the American Jewish community, speak to the American Jewish community as though we were family. And I think everybody just adored her, and still do. I have a hairdresser who's not Jewish, who's Catholic, who told me, "Oh, you wrote about Golda Meir? My God, she's my favorite person." So she was beloved, imagine, in America. In Israel, just remember that even after the Yom Kippur War, she still won an election. She was really very much admired in Israel for a very long time. And then after the Yom Kippur War, and I'd say even later than that, people who had worked with her, men who had worked with her and had their grievances, people who were still, suffering and pained by the Yom Kippur War, looked back and turned and blamed her, I think, in many ways unfairly. Not that this book is a hagiography, not that I think everything she did was wonderful, but I think she was unfairly blamed. I think in Israel, some of those people who spoke negatively about her and wrote negatively about her, that idea became widespread. And as I say, the Yom Kippur War turned people against her. And it's taken a very long time. I do hope, and I think it is changing in Israel as well. I think as more information gets out about the Yom Kippur War and about Golda, I think people in Israel will start appreciating her also. And I will say this, I think young people in Israel, or certainly young women, I think, have begun to appreciate her. I have found when I've gone to Israel, and I've said I was working on a biography of Golda Meir, every shop that I went into, whenever I met a young shopkeeper or a young woman studying in school, the answer was always, "Oh, really? She's my ideal." So I'm hoping that her image in Israel will change.
I think so too. I think the image of Golda is not the same it was even 10 years ago. And it's not about new knowledge about Yom Kippur, because she was not just prime minister. She's done a lot of things before that as a leader of the labor movement, as a labor minister, and then as a foreign minister. And I think it's important too. We all see it through the Yom Kippur lens, but it's much more than that. And your book is bringing us all that. And I want to ask about her American. It's now 100 years to her Aliyah, immigration. And you're writing a lot about this voyage to Israel, which was very eventful and hard, but in a minute I will ask about that. But the second chapter in the book is called An American Girl. And I wanted to ask, what do you think is American about, what is this American girl? What was her American experience as a girl?
I'm glad you asked that, because there was a perception that she lived in a ghetto, and she did, in a way, a Jewish ghetto in Milwaukee, and therefore had no contact. It was the same kind of shtetl, in a sense, Jewish life as the Jews had in Kiev and Pinsk and so on. But I didn't find that to be true, because although she lived in that kind of a ghetto, she was exposed. Milwaukee was a socialist city at that time. There were people standing on soapboxes on the corner every week. She couldn't have missed that. She was exposed to all of that. She went to a school there that was not only for Jews. So she learned American history. She learned about democracy. She learned about the Civil War, about Abraham Lincoln, about many things that influenced American children, and she was influenced by that as well. I looked at some of the textbooks she saw as a child, and in those days it was. They blew up America. Was the most wonderful place in the world. There was nothing wrong with America. So she imbibed some of that and really developed a great love for America. So I think that was one part of it. The other part, in my opinion, Milwaukee, Wisconsin at that time was in some ways on the frontier. The country was still growing. And there was this sense of growth, of optimism, of expansion. And she had to have absorbed that also, because it was, again, part of her daily living. And I think that influenced her. She was an optimist maybe by nature, but I think that kind of American optimism and looking forward to what's next and what can be done, and hard work, the American idea of hard work, and you get what you achieve what you work for. That was part of her thinking as well. So I think some of that, or much of it, also came from America.
When you wrote about Milwaukee, her place in Milwaukee, and you wrote about this socialism, a kind of socialism environment in the city, and about the frontier. So I wanted to ask if you think there's a connection between her connection to pioneering in Israel and the pioneering of in United States, in the Western United States.
I think there might be some connection. I don't want to push it too far, because that would not be true. She had joined the Polei Zion, which was a socialist party, and had a pioneering in its thinking. But I think she was encouraged by the pioneering atmosphere she lived in, and by the openness. If you lived in New York, it was tenements, it was dark. There were big buildings. You never saw, I mean, my parents came to New York around that time, my father anyway, around that same time. You never saw green, you never saw a park. She saw those things. So she saw that openness, she saw the possibilities. Not that they lived well, they were very poor, but they lived in houses. They had a backyard. They had things that you didn't have in New York. And I do think to some extent that influenced her. I can't say had she lived in New York, she wouldn't have been who she was. I could not say that. But I think it encouraged her, or the atmosphere encouraged her.
But you wrote in the book, she's not a typical Jewish, American Jewish girl, because she's not from New York and not even from Chicago or LA or something, or one of the big cities. It's something special that this specific family went to Milwaukee and not to the one of the American shtetls.
Right, so, well, yes, because her father, that was her father's doing, which I think is incredible. He was just part of a group, you know, the Jews in New York particularly, there were organizations that were trying to spread the Jews out from away from New York and Chicago and Boston, those big cities, and have the Jews spread out throughout the country. You know, part of it was they didn't want the German Jews who were here first were very helpful. They took care of the East European Jews, but they didn't want too many of them congregating in one place. It sort of embarrassed them. You know, the German Jews had already become assimilated. So they were encouraging organizations and Jews to spread out. For the most part, it did not work, but it worked with her father. And he went to Milwaukee, of all places. And as it turned out, there was a Jewish community in Milwaukee. So that was a very different kind of experience. And as I say, I think a very positive one.
So before I'm going to her aliyah, I wanted to ask, what do you think, what stayed in her life, or what remained in her life from this American girl? In what way she was an American girl as a grown-up, as a leader, and so on?
That's a wonderful question. For one thing, she loved chocolate ice cream that she would sit in coffee shops.
Okay.
In fact, the owner of Haagen-Dazs ice cream said they once packed her plane with ice and the ice cream in it, but that's just an aside. For one thing, she went back to America almost every year except for the war years. She loved being in America. She had criticisms, and particularly criticisms of young people, and we could talk about that. But she loved being here. She loved shopping in Macy's, which is a very big department store, still is, in New York. So she spoke English beautifully. She didn't speak Hebrew perfectly. She spoke probably better English than she spoke Hebrew, I'm not sure. Spoke Yiddish best of all. But so I think, and she always admired the democracy of America, and she always admired or tried to strengthen the relationship, as she did, between Israel and America, because she knew that was so important. And she knew from her growing up years how important America was. So I think there's a piece of that American girl was always in her. And she loved the American Jewish community. She was very disappointed in the American Jewish community that did not make Aliyah. And she was always saying to them, I didn't use this, but I have a tape and a written text of her speaking to a group at the 92nd Street Y, which is a big place in New York. I have her speaking to them and saying, explain to me, why didn't you want to make Aliyah? So she was very disappointed in the American Jewish community because of that. On the other hand, she felt very warm and comfortable with that community. And not long before she died, she appeared in America and spoke to the community. People say it was like her farewell to them, and they felt so close to her and she to them. So I think there was always a little piece of that American girl in her.
I want to ask you. You said she was disappointed with Jews in America. They didn't make Aliyah, but she knew the importance of the Jewish voice of America, didn't she?
Yes.
Isn't it a kind of contradiction?
It is.
She leaned on the Jews of America all her life. She was in America in the early 30s as a secretary of Pioneer Women. And then as after that, in 48 and 47 and 48, and raised a lot of money, isn't it a contradiction between this disappointment and this importance of?
Yes, you're absolutely right, Gili. And I think that goes on until this very day, frankly. There was always, the Israeli leaders have been disappointed that there were not more Americans making Aliyah. On the other hand, Golda in particular, certainly, you're absolutely right, counted on American money, American Jewish money. That's why she came every year.
Money and power, not just money, I think.
Yes, absolutely. Money and power. And that was why she came every year. She spoke to every organization. Hadassah, which was a very powerful, was becoming, not quite yet, but was really becoming very powerful women's Zionist organization. She spoke to them. That was a Zionist group, but they weren't making, for most of them, were not making Aliyah. So you're right, it was a contradiction, but she lived with that contradiction. She wanted it both ways, let's put it that way.
And as you were saying, she wasn't the only one. A lot of the leaders.
We have been yelled at and criticized by other leaders, and some of us have felt guilty. On the other hand, we have supported Israel both financially, psychologically, and sociologically in every way possible.
I think guilt is part of Jewishness, so it's okay. But Golda, as we were saying, she made Aliyah in 1921, in the summer of 1921. And she was unique in that, because there was never a lot of immigration, Jews that immigrated from United States to Israel. Right. And what happened there? Because it's unique. It's not the rule. So what happened? Why do you think she decided to immigrate, to make Aliyah?
I think she was moving in that direction, really. Once she joined, she had been very influenced by her sister, Shana, and she joined Polei Zion because of Shana, and I think she had been moving in that direction all along, and then realized at one point, either I'm going to do this or I'm not going to do this. I've got to do this. But what I thought was really courageous and special is that if you think of all the other founders of the state, Ben-Gurion, Sharet, and so on, they all came from countries, as Golda had been born in Kiev, they all came from Eastern Europe, where Jews were not well treated, where Jews were persecuted, where there were pogroms, where there were, very bad things. So it makes sense when you think about it. Get out of those countries, go someplace else, go to Palestine, start something new. But here she was in a country where, okay, there was anti-Semitism, but, this was a country where Jews were fit in and had all the equal rights with anybody else. She didn't have to leave. She could have stayed in America. She would have, I don't know, risen to some, with her talent, she would have risen some maybe politically, but she chose to give that up and to go to Palestine. So in that way, I believe, in some sense, she was more courageous than all those men who, in a sense, left a bad situation. She left a good situation and decided to go. She decided to go. She was very, very taken with the Zionist idea. When she was, she lived with her sister in Denver for a while, and there were these intellectual circles where they discussed Zionism. They discussed everything. But the more she heard about it, the more she was drawn to the Zionist idea and to the idea of starting a new country for Jews, a nation, a land for Jews alone. And I think she finally decides she'll do it. Either I'm going to do it or I'm not going to do it, and this is the time to do it. That was, I think, her feeling.
So the thing was new thing. So the newness of this nation. You think that's what attracted to her?
Sorry, say that again. The what?
The newness, the thing that is new.
That was new. No, I think it was really her dedication to new in a sense of, yes, being a pioneer. But I think it was her dedication to the Jewish people. I think she felt, yes, the Jewish people need to have a home of their own. At that point, I don't know if they weren't really talking about a state necessarily, but that was in the back of people's minds.
Yeah.
And I think that's what she was thinking about.
Okay. And can you say, as I was saying, her voyage to Palestine, to Israel, to Eretz Israel, was eventful, and she wrote about it in Chayai, but when you wrote it in the book about the strike of the sailors and so on, it was it got so interesting about that. And she met you wrote that she met in the way pioneers from Lithuania, and that they didn't want to be connected to this American girl, not just her. They were a group of American people. So, and I think it's a symbol to the way that Zionists from Eastern Europe saw those American, not just girls. So, what do you think was the burden of being American in Zionist Israel?
Well, there was, when she first came to Merchavia, many of those settlers themselves had come from American backgrounds. They looked down on her. Oh, yeah, a spoiled American girl. What is she going to do? She going to know how to work in the field? Was she going to dirty her hands? And she proved herself. She felt she had to prove herself to them as an American girl can. Yes, she can work. She worked so her hands that she could barely move her fingers. Worked harder than anybody else, because they did see Americans as sort of spoiled. Not the real thing. What did they know? The Lithuanians on the ship also, they saw themselves as they were the pioneers. And what do these people know? They're coming from a land of plenty. What do they know about deprivation and working hard? And she felt she had to prove herself, and she did.
In a big way.
Big way. I just would like to say, before we end, I do want to make clear, much later, that she did strengthen the relationship between the United States and Israel in ways that nobody before her, and maybe nobody after her, did. She really, in a sense, put Israel on the map for the United States, even though American Jews didn't like Nixon, but he was helpful to Israel, and she saw to it that the Israel embassy was a powerhouse, that decisions were made through Washington. So she continued that streak of Americanism in a very positive way for Israel.
We don't have a lot of time, and I want to ask you two more questions. So I'll try, okay? the first one, which is, I'm just curious, can you see connection between Henrietta Saul, that you are writing about her now, and Golda Meir. And if you can do it,
I can. In fact, I've had to control myself. Henrietta, these are smaller books than books in this series. And I mentioned Golda only once or twice. I have to control myself because I know so much more about Golda. But Henrietta's almost like a generation before Golda. But one of the things I have in this book is that Golda remembered when she first came to Palestine, Henrietta Zold was already there. And Zold, although her Hebrew, she really struggled, but Zold was this real intellectual, and she studied Hebrew, and she felt that it was very important that Americans speak Hebrew in Palestine. So Golda at that time knew not a word of Hebrew. So she for some reason, she wanted to talk to Henrietta Zold. And the people, she was in Merchavia, and the people in Merchavia said to her, don't even think about it. You cannot go there until you learn Hebrew, because she will not look down on you. You have to learn Hebrew first. So of course, now much later, much later, when it was the 100th anniversary of Henrietta Zold's birth, Golda was chair of the commission that was celebrating Henrietta Zold's birth. But I will say this, that there were differences, although they didn't deal with each other as far as I can see. But Henrietta Zold was part of what was called Ichud, was an organization, and who believed in Arab Jewish, a binational state at that time. Golda never believed in that, nor did Ben Gurion. So there would have been that great difference if they'd had a discussion about it. I don't believe they did, but they were the two greatest American Jewish women who made lives in Palestine. And
so I will end with a question about that, about the two. You said the two most powerful women, Jewish women in the United States. And we said approximately nothing about her womanhood, about her being a powerful. Although you write about it a lot on the book, and it's very important in the book. What can we learn as women in the third decades of the 21st century from this very strong woman that was a prime minister of Israel in the 70s, in the end of the 60s and the 70s, which were a very complicated time in Israel?
Well, yes.
So I asked what we as women can learn from her.
You can learn, I think it was an absolute determination. She never identified as a feminist, but feminists can identify with her in that sense. Determination, hard work, you can get what you want. I mean, I've been involved in feminism, so I know how difficult it is, but you can get what you want if you stick to it and you don't let yourself be pushed aside by men, and you don't let their louder voices overwhelm you. Your voice, Golda, always made sure her voice was heard and her ideas were heard, and she was strong, and she maintained that strength even if men looked down on her. And she didn't try to be a man. She was herself. She was a woman. She didn't say, oh, look at me, I'm just like all the men. She had her nails done every week. She cared about how she looked, but she used the symbols that are connected with women, like the kitchen. She used them in a way as a source of power. Golda's kitchen were people who are the leaders of her party who met with her to make decisions. She didn't mind the term Golda's kitchen. She used it. She turned it around and used it in a positive way. So I think those are things.
And in Israeli politics, the term the kitchen, or maybe even the kitchenette, is a term of power, because the most powerful person in the government are meeting in the kitchen.
That's right. That started with Golda.
Yeah, it started with Golda. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, so she turned what would be a symbol of a woman, women are in the kitchen, into a symbol of power. And I think that's fantastic. I think those are things that women have to keep in mind and sticking to it. I mean, it's unfortunate there have been no other women since Golda. And I know there are no women who've been president of the United States. So we still have a ways to go. But Golda can be a symbol, an ideal for us.
Of course, we have a way to go. And I think if I can say, Golda believed in organizing and going together and in the party and politics. And I think my generation ran out of politics, and this is part of the problem. So this is from my perspective.
That's a very good point. She certainly did believe in politics and in organ, very much so. That was what she did. She organized people all the time. And you're right. And this generation doesn't do that. Yours or mine right now in America, it's too bad. So that is another thing people can learn from Golda. There's a great deal one can learn from her. And what she herself said is, when you really care about something, you stay with it and you work as hard as you can to achieve what you want to achieve. And that's a good lesson for anything, from women and for men, I think, and for children also.
So thank you very much for this talk and for the book. And it is long, but it's interesting. You can read it like like that. So I think part of this is so important, and there are some that I was surprised from some of the things that I didn't know about as a historian that deal with feminism and Zionism. It is fascinating. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gili. I loved your question, and it's great to meet you, really. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.